I'll get right into it. We only have an hour, 59 minutes left. My name is Ivan Watkins. I'm a ethnohistorian. I'm also an artist. I'm a muralist. I'm an arts educator. I've done more than 4 dozen murals around the country, various lectures. I actually created a humanities and arts festival focused on Black Indians in the city of Chicago back in 1995 and 96. I've been researching African and Native American interrelations for almost 2 decades or more. I was adopted by a Lakota family and grew up in the Native American church in Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota. I'm still in contact with the family. I'm a pipe carrier, been up on the hills, Vision Quest. I've done lectures and film screenings and a wide range of things, and a lot of research. In fact, I was invited to the University of Chicago, where I got my master's in social science. Based on my work on Black Indians, they actually created a course called Black Indians. And that paved the way for me to end up with a sort of the red carpet treatment there and finish the master's program in social science. So I have a wide range of different things to share, a lot of information, and it's a lot to present. So I'm going to do my best to be as comprehensive as possible. Please feel free. I'm going to save questions for the end, but please feel free to ask questions at any point because I have so much information. I'd rather cater the information to what your interests are and where we are in the conversation. I have more of a conversation than just a dry lecture, if that makes sense. Give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up some things here. First, let me just start by defining what I mean by Black Indians. This is, for me, it started out as a sort of a personal quest to understand who I am. I grew up here in New Orleans, Louisiana. And in New Orleans, Louisiana, I'm going to show you videos and a lot of photos and other things shortly. We have a tradition that's was documented since the 1870s of people masking as Indians for carnival. And I also grew up here where we have a Creole class and culture. And growing up mostly in the Creole community of downtown New Orleans, I found myself oftentimes the darkest skinned person in the room, and people I grew up around the corner from Polish, Italian, Black people who did their St. Joseph's altars for St. Joseph in the keeping of their Italian tradition. So a lot of people of mixed heritage who still identified as Black. So this led me to try to understand, well, who am I? I mean, my family didn't really consider themselves Creole, and I started doing this genealogical research. My parents were doing genealogical research. And I was brought up with this innate sense that this was a part of who I am. So that launched my quest into trying to figure it out. Now, I'm saying this to preface that when I say Black Indians, my vision of it started where most of us probably are when I say the term, trying to imagine African descendants that were brought through the slave trade to the Americas, that were either adopted, absorbed into Native American communities, or intermarried into them and produced a new sort of people, so to speak, that we would term Black Indians. Now, the reason why this is significant, I'm going to clarify later in more depth. But let me just say that our understanding of what we think of phenotypically and the archetype of an Indian, quote unquote, is largely informed by Hollywood and largely informed by a lot of misinformation. Even the DNA studies about who's Indian, who's not, negate something that's been suppressed information in academia. And it's been a real challenge speaking with like my mentor, Helen Tanner, Dr. Helen Tanner, for example, who was a cartographer and renowned American Indian historian. The conversations I had with her doing research at the Newberry Library. She gradually saw my point that there's something to Black people claiming to be Indian, more than the way Skip Gates, for example, at Harvard treated it, saying, well, a lot of people claim that to hide a mixture of European heritage, and they're actually part white, quote unquote, and not actually Indian. And they claim to be Indian to hide that part or to claim something else. And that's sort of a predictable way that we tend to look at that, racial categories. So I had to really get into racialization. How did we get to these terms of race, and what do they mean, and how are they defined, and how are they projected? And this is a very complicated topic, but I just want to say real quick that one of the things that I've come to most recently, and I think a lot of people are coming to in public discourse, is that there were in fact indigenous people that would phenotypically or archetypally be considered Black in today's terms, that were here in the Americas, archaeologically proven, prior to the Bering Strait migration that we believe is the population or the peopling of North, Central, and South America migrating across the Bering Strait from Asia. Now, of course, people did migrate across the Bering Strait and did populate the Americas. Some narratives now are saying that they encountered an indigenous group that were much larger people, that were Black people that had a very advanced culture, very, very peaceful people, and in a lot of cases annihilated them, essentially. So my definition of Indian, let me just say this, includes what would be considered indigenous people that were not African imports, that were indigenous to this land prior to the Bering Strait migrations. Also includes people who were the byproduct of that migration and intermarriage, intermingling. So American Indians are basically, in my estimation as an anthropologist, an amalgam of indigenous Black people, Asiatic people that migrated across the Bering Strait. You had Vikings here, the dragon shipmen and rune stones, pre-Columbus. We also had Chinese people here, and then you had Africans sailing back and forth, and actually American Indians sailing and trading internationally across the waters as well. Now, a lot of that's very hard for us to imagine, because we tend to think of quote unquote Indians as people living as hunter-gatherers, wearing buckskins and feathers. And this is the image that we have globally. So in my work in Brazil, you're going to see some of that. The portrayal of the quote unquote Indian, even in South America, is and throughout the Caribbean, as it manifests in the carnival traditions, for example, or other cultural practices, alludes to that phenotype and the archetype that we think of. But the actual genetic, genealogical, historical, anthropological legacy of who is in fact indigenous or Indian is a lot more complicated than that. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So let me pull up some images so that we're not just looking at my lovely face here. One second. Wait a minute. Okay, what happened here? All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Okay. All right. This was something I presented at the anthropological conference, American Association of Anthropology conference, and was a theme of my PhD dissertation. I'm still not completed my dissertation at the University of New Orleans, but I am a PhD candidate, and my focus is on Black Indians. And really looking at this interrelation, uprisings, the notion of resistance. I know that's one of the things Lori mentioned. So my position is basically that cultural preservation or survival for people in the Americas has been largely through identity maintenance. So this idea of claiming an Indian heritage is as important to people's cultural preservation and to their survival as a people as it is the narratives that we're given. So yes, of course, millions of people were brought across the Atlantic slave trade from Africa and populated our Western Hemisphere, the Americas and the Caribbean, but not all quote unquote Black people are just from Africa. I'm going to show you evidence of that in a minute. The images you're seeing here are from Carnival. They're two photos that my parents took actually from like in the 70s, early 70s, and also from like the 50s of our Carnival traditions. And here people preserve this idea, this notion of Indianness is maintained through the Carnival expression of what we call quote unquote Mardi Gras Indians. Now people calling themselves Black masking Indians. So in trying to understand that culture, it's been described as African Americans for the reasons that I explained, masquerading as Indians. In their own narrative, they'll say they're paying tribute to American Indians that offered refuge for runaway slaves. So there's this notion of maroons or Seminole-Asian, Seminones or maroonage that's tied to the notion of Indianness. Does that make sense? Yes? Are you with me? Okay, I see at least one head nodding. Okay, so the word Seminones is from what I've been informed is an Arawakan term, Semiloni, that the Spanish adopted and referred to domesticated pigs that would run away and become wild pigs. They would be called Seminones. Now, this term was also applied to people who would escape from the colonial paradigm and live in the fastnesses or the woods or the wildernesses, if they were runaway slaves, for example. And this term Seminones became Seminole. It also became maroon. So the word Seminones is the root of maroon, is also the root of Seminole, all of which would mean wild or runaway. So this notion of Indianness we equate with wildness, okay? So we can consider the Mardi Gras Indians of New Orleans, for example, urban maroons, the same in Brazil with the Bumba Meu Boi and Caboclos in Maranhão and in Pernambuco in the northeast of Brazil. They're essentially maroons. In Brazil, we have what are called quilombos. The quilombos are also known throughout Central America and Spanish-speaking nations as palenques. Palenqueros, macombos are all referring to these maroon villages of people that were not quite Indian entirely, but they were not quite African, not in terms of being slaves. Now, to what extent they were Black in appearance, to what extent they were mixed genetically or intermarried Africans and indigenous people could be argued, but these terms sort of encompass all of that. In fact, you can, unfortunately I don't have the visual right here, but in fact, the caboclos, for example, in northeast of Brazil, you'll find there's two manifestations of that Black Indian carnival tradition. One is more indigenous and the other is more Black. Even though they wear the same garb, they organize their tribes that way. And I'll get into some of that, more of that later. This is a bit complicated. Can you see this? Is it clear enough? Is it legible on your screens? Okay, I put this tri-racial cultural interaction chart together based on a flow chart that I got from an anthropological conference that was back in the 70s. And I kind of adapted their format to the historical research that I was doing. So if you look at the top here, you see France and Spain put battle for Louisiana, the control of ports of Orleans, Mobile Bay, and you also have the revolutions in Haiti, the French Enlightenment. All of these things influenced the development of our society. Also, the Enlightenment, in a sense, had a role to play in the abolitionist movement and this sense of becoming a self or resistance. And some people point to things, the revolution in Haiti having influence there as well. The center panel, you have the Americans who inevitably were warring against Spain, the British, and indigenous people. And this is, you could look at the War of 1812, also the Creek War. I consider these sorts of historical events, the Creek War in particular, the largest slave revolt in North America, which is posited in American Indian history, not at all in African American history. And well, let me just give that story real quick. If you look over here, we have the three sort of racial groups, okay? Euro-American, quote unquote, white people. Some came here enslaved, some were indentured, others were free. Some sought religious freedom, some were penal colonists sent here by their colonial, their kingdoms to clean their streets up. You know, they cleaned the streets of Europe up by sending the criminals to the penal colony to populate over there. And then eventually formed government and shaped power. Here we have Native Americans, red. I put red because that's the archetype, what we tend to think of. Some were free, some were enslaved. American Indians being enslaved is not something that most people are very aware of, but they were exported even from the Choctaw, for example, and some Seminoles ended up in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean, being exported as slaves to work elsewhere. And then you have the Africans. Now the Indians, the idea of how Indians were viewed, they were either allies or enemies. So they were either friendly or enemy, hostile or friendly, depending on whose side they're on. That makes sense. So the English, for example, allied with the Cherokee, and the French allied with the Choctaw, and of course used their tribal enmity to help them depopulate themselves and gain control of much of their lands and so on. I don't want to get into that narrative. It's a lot more complicated than that. But in broad strokes, you can see where I'm going. Everybody with me still? Okay, for Africans, you had enslaved Africans as well as free. I have to make a point here that what ties New Orleans and let me back up a second. The colonial powers had their policies were established by the Catholic Church. This is something that most people don't know. The jurisprudence over the crowns by the Catholic Church. And part of the Reformation was removing authority of the church over the crown, and this Lutheran movement and revolts and shifting in that direction. So where you have Catholic colonial, Catholic-based colonies, French, Spanish, or Portuguese colonies, the policies that they had encouraged miscegenation because it lent itself to a more stable colony. But within that miscegenation, they had to create then a caste system. So the caste system allowed for free people of color. It also meant that being Catholic, you had to be baptized. So they were considered humans and had souls. So what a lot of people don't understand, we're talking about race and all of that, New Orleans was actually founded as an integrated city. It did not become segregated until it became part of the United States after the Louisiana Purchase and the Battle of Orleans. And the more Americanized New Orleans became, the more segregated it became. And so, in fact, let me give you a quick anecdote to understand the significance of that. Has anyone ever heard of Homer Plessy? Yes, is that a yes or no? Homer Plessy versus Ferguson? Okay, the Plessy versus Ferguson case established the legal precedent for Jim Crow policies in the South. What most people don't understand is that Homer Plessy was a free man of color that was used as an example to make a case by the free people of color movement here in New Orleans that segregating train cars did not make sense because Homer Plessy was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed black man, and they chose him for that reason, to sit in the white section of the train. And when asked to move, they asked him, "Are you black or white?" He said, "I'm black." And then that case went to the Supreme Court. He lost, and that Ferguson case led to basically set the legal precedent for Jim Crow segregation in the South and throughout the United States, and also shaped indirectly Hitler and Nazi policy in Germany later. But what we don't understand is that this was a reaction to free people of color resisting segregation to begin with. I think it's important to understand that. So we have Indian policies. I'm sorry, let me go back to the Catholic side. So Catholic colonies, then you're going to have this caste system of basically the whiter you are, more European you are, the higher you are in the caste system. So here in New Orleans, you have Creoles that would try to intermarry and become lighter and lighter and lighter over time and pass for white. They call passé blanc, and would actually marry white aristocrats, these Creole debutantes and so on. And they'd have Creole balls, and there's a lot of history about that. But what we don't understand is that in the 1700s here, you had more free people of color than white, which is very, very difficult for us to visualize. So I'm just trying to give you that a lot of what we've been taught and what we visualize when we think about the past is really very, very biased and limited. And if we look at history itself, it's a lot more complicated. So you got a legacy of people that were free, artisans and merchants, craftsmen and tradesmen here that, eventually became sort of displaced by European immigrants and racial hostility. So going back a little bit further and going back to the East and to the development of America itself, the United States of America, Indian policy was basically guided by the civilization program. The civilization program was launched initially with Tecumseh and the Shawnee. And Tecumseh, because of his contact with further Eastern tribes, was aware of the sort of genocidal agenda that was behind the treaties and civilization program. Now, the civilization program itself was designed to limit the land usage so that land usage could eventually be acquired and access to lands justified by introducing chattel slavery to American Indians, as well as providing them with pigs or cattle, log cabins, sometimes seeds to start farming and stuff like that. That policy went all the way to the West. If you look at the tribes all the way into Utah and places like that, they went through the same thing where they attempted to civilize it. But this began in the East and eventually came to the South. When it failed with the Shawnee, the federal government decided to try it with the Creeks. So with the Creeks, you found, basically it started there and extended to include what we call the 5 civilized tribes. And those 5 civilized tribes are Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, and Seminole. The Seminole would be here on our hostile side, because the Seminoles were the least, or most reluctant, I should say, or least willing to go along with the civilization program and this notion of chattel slavery. Now, Tecumseh is important going back to the Creek War of 1812, because he actually came to the Creek Council, and I believe it was in 1810. And there he made a case that, look, these people don't mean well. They intend to kill us and to take our land and then destroy our way of life. Let's take these ruffled shirts off. Let's take these, burn these log cabins and slaughter these pigs and stuff and put our feathers back on and go back to our traditional ways. Some of the Creeks sided with him. Those Creeks became Red Sticks. The Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims, was one of the largest massacres of American settlers in American history, but we don't know about it. This is just north of Mobile, Alabama. And that sparked what became the Creek War, which brought Andrew Jackson down to the south, to the Gulf Coast, where you had Negro forts. Again, the Spanish were in control of Florida. Now, Spanish policy, because it was Catholic, just like the French, allowed for the miscegenation, allowed for blacks and our Indian people to be free as long as they fought on the side of the Spanish crown against the Americans or the British and or the French. And so you had Negro forts. Am I getting too deep into one area? Should I zoom out some more here? So in broader strokes then, this notion of resistance on the American Indian flow, you can see some went for the civilization program, eventually were removed through the Removal Act that created the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. This is where my family actually, we call it Trail of Tears, ended up in Indian Territory in Oklahoma and then moved from there to Louisiana. Those that sort of aligned with it found themselves on smaller and smaller reduced reservations, now getting some reparations from the federal government. But some of those 5 tribes in Oklahoma and eastern bands too fought on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So today you'll find varying sort of attitudes that they may have about African Americans or Black Indians being amongst them, largely because the federal government forced them to adopt the Africans that they had come into possession of as chattel slaves. They forced them after the Civil War to adopt those people as members of their tribe. And the Chickasaws were the first to resist that. And the legal battles with that are still going on right up until today. So you'll hear things about the Black freedmen of the Cherokee and are suing for tribal enrollment, or the Seminole freedmen are being disenfranchised. This is all the fallout of this civilization program, forced removal, and really the whole agenda of racialization, which was to create separation between the races. And this was essential. It was actually one of the top priorities for the colonial powers. One of their number one policies for the New World was to maintain the reconcilable differences between the Africans they were bringing in and in the indigenous populations, primarily because the European settlers were most often outnumbered by them. And to maintain stable colonies, they tried to pit those people against one another. Thus, this whole image of the sort of Roman nose, straight-haired, light-skinned archetype as an Indian was pushed and still is today as what an Indian looks like. And if we look at them, you'll see people, full-blood Indians, sometimes darker than me. Any questions so far? Am I going too slow, too fast? Is everything okay? Get a thumbs up. Am I all right? We're doing okay? All right. Interesting, boring? Spice it up. Okay, well, let me just wrap up this chart and show you that what I was pointing out here is that out of this Seminole, or you have re-Africanization. Pan-Africanism is one manifestation of that. The whole Garvey movement, back to Africa, and this whole notion of preserving an African identity. But also you have in that an Indian identity that's forged, a nativization, and a sort of escape to the hills. But then you also have alcoholism, and then a cultural revitalization against that, which I think the Native American church is the best example of that, where peyote and things like that created sort of pan-Indian movements across tribes that were formerly enemies, and sort of a pan-Indian self-realization. But unfortunately, because of racialization and some of the things I pointed out, the quote-unquote Black Indians or Black darker-skinned people are sort of etched out of that. Meaning that if I claim to have American Indian heritage, it's harder for me to get tribal enrollment as a Cherokee, even though I can prove genealogy and lineage that's Cherokee, than if I was white, if that makes sense. So in fact, a lot of the Eastern Coast tribes and those in California, people that don't look like the archetype Indians have a difficult time with gaining tribal enrollment or even tribal recognition as a tribe. The Lumbees are a perfect example of that. Tuscarora, you can look at the Pequot up in Connecticut. The Golden Hill Pagosids don't have federal recognition as a tribe. And if you look at those populations today, a lot of them look like the Creoles from New Orleans, if that makes sense. All right, you with me? Let's get some more visual stuff here. So in New Orleans, the New Orleans Indians carry this African indigenous historic memory of a colonial resistance to slavery and colonialism. And they do it through this carnival tradition and complex beadwork. And the beadwork, as you can see, most often depicts the archetype American Indian. The people wearing the stuff will oftentimes be, phenotypically Black or African American. So some people have argued that this is an African tradition manifest in an American Indian motif. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's also some truth to people claiming that they're more Indian than African, even though they're Black. And in other words, we need to look at that more carefully, study and be open to examining that. I had to make the case with my own PhD committee, saying that people claiming that there was pre-Columbian contact between Africans and American Indian people is crackpot, and it's like, no, the archaeological evidence is pretty clear and it's everywhere. In fact, you have Mayan glyphs in the pyramids in Egypt. So clearly the people were trading and traveling back and forth. This is very complex. If I'm getting your attention, I'm saying the same thing over and over. History is very, very complex. I can't present all of it within an hour, but I'm hoping to give you some broad strokes and pique some interest and maybe expand this discussion. I should have pulled up this slide earlier, but this is what I was talking about. Seminole, Cimarrones, Seminoles, Maroons all mean runaways. And then you have your FMCs, free men of color. This etching actually looks more like a lithograph, is actually from Brazil. And this is showing you that the mixed race colonial caste class environment where someone that's clearly of African heritage is affluent and not only a free person of color, but of an upper caste as well. And they tended to be, again, the lighter skinned people, as you can see here. And you see the darker skinned people tend to be more in positions of servitude, but not always the case. So in essence, America, for me, is this is red, black, and white, not red, white, and blue. And this triracial amalgam is what makes up most of our populace today. Of course, you have waves of immigrants that came, especially in the 1800s, that completely repopulated, overpopulated urban areas and changed the demographics and the power structure. I think New Orleans exemplifies that, from Germany, from Ireland, from Italy, and so on. But if you look at the older, more indigenous Americans, you see this triracial mixture. In fact, a lot of the missionary ethnographers, when they would go out to survey for the government, didn't know what to expect because the people would be intermingled. Let me make the point that a lot of these so-called Indian chiefs, even Red Stick warriors that fought against the Americans and Americanization and against the civilization program, may have been Scottish, they may have been Irish, they may have been English in heritage and have become American Indian in their identity and their cultural identification, for example, and in their lifestyle. Osceola, for example, one of our more well-known Seminole war chiefs, was half British. I mean, I think his father was British and his mother a Black Indian. Through the civilization program, you also have, again, here an example of this sort of white Indian archetype. Part of the civilization program was to not only reduce land usage, but to change the culture. So American Indians were historically mostly and culturally matrilineal. So if you married an American Indian woman, you became part of her clan. So wealthy white merchants that married American Indian women became members of their clans. And part of the civilization change was making those American Indian tribes more and more patriarchal, and having the men be more and more in positions of leadership, where traditionally it would have been a queen mother who would send a man as her delegate to the council, not just a man kind of in charge. So this is an actual image of a Cherokee chief, John Ross here. Here you have Seminoles in Oklahoma. And you can see clearly at least one of those men is definitively Black. This is just sort of re-summarizing some of what I've already talked about. Indianness is expressed as wildness or harjo. This particular image is a still from a video beadwork by one of our Mardi Gras Indian chiefs that's passed, Mr. Ferdinand Big R Sr. But he was trying to show that narrative where you see the archetypal African marrying the archetypal American Indian. This is the narrative that we get, the narrative that even the Mardi Gras Indians portray. That's not necessarily the whole story. This is actually a mural I did, a detail of a mural I did in Chicago, portraying DeSable. It's the same sort of image. But here you have the founder of the city of Chicago was a half French African from Haiti who landed in New Orleans and went up the Mississippi River to Ohio Valley, married an indigenous woman, and established a fort, a trading post near the fort where the Chicago River meets Lake Michigan, and founded the city of Chicago, or Chicago. And his name is Jean-Baptiste DeSable. Here you have images of Seminoles. These are Seminole Indians in Florida. Here you have the Mardi Gras Indians. This is the downtown style. This is our legendary chief here, Big Chief Tootie Montana. There's actually a bronze statue of him in Armstrong Park in the center of downtown New Orleans, honoring his contribution to our local culture. He was on the cover of New York Times when he passed. I mean, he was that renowned. I want to get past some of the history, but these are just some examples of uprisings to show you that there's a clear pattern, and that these places and time periods are in broad strokes, but it was a hotbed for resistance and activity. This image is clearly depicting the revolution in Haiti. A lot of those people that fled Haiti ended up in New Orleans. In fact, the Lafitte brothers, who were part of the leading the Battle of Orleans on the side of the Americans against the Spanish and the British, were former slaveholders from Haiti that came here. They were pirates also. But there's a lot of connections between the Caribbean, Central, South America, and so on. In fact, the energy of resistance, what I found is around 1811, 1812, the suspected uprisings, the hotbeds of numerous revolts that happened from the East Coast, with Denmark Vesey, all the way to the 1811 revolt here in Deslon Plantation in New Orleans. It was, that time period was a very, very critical period where I believe there may have been some broader conversation between people that may have actually shifted the course and formation of our country had they been more successful. Or even if just the people here in New Orleans fought in the Battle of Orleans on the side of the Spanish or the British, who offered freedom to Africans and abolished slavery prior to that, you know, this country wouldn't be what it is today, if that makes sense. But the significance of New Orleans was because of the port and control of the river. Just some notes here. This is sort of an image of the old days. Quick note here, I'm going to skip over this quickly though. Cajun culture, which is not the same as Creole culture, was actually born out of people that came from Acadiana to Louisiana. And their unique brand of culture was actually shaped by those Maroons, the people that were living in the swamps. I'll show you Chief Warhorse in a minute. I have evidence of the indigenous North American Black person who claims, I am an indigenous North American Black person. I'm not an African. I'm a full-blood Indian, and she's Black. Some American Indian people here locally argue and say, no, don't lie, you're part African. And she said, no, I'm an Indian. And she's still on her historic land and in possession of the land grants. I mean, I'm looking at the actual charter and land grant signed by Ulysses S. Grant to her great whatever grandfather on the land that she's still on. So this is a bit redundant. We'll focus too much on Mardi Gras Indians. But the idea with the Mardi Gras Indians is we want to look at, well, are they playing Indian, paying tribute, or being Indian? And my notion is that, you know, it's posited as being Indian, as playing Indian, but in fact, by doing this for over, you know, almost 200 years already, documented, we don't know how long it's been going on, people are actually preserving this American Indian identity. So just to give some scholarly background again, then I want to get to video stuff and more entertaining and engaging stuff than just text and talking head. Is everyone familiar with the terms edic, emic, and etic? Yes or no? No? Etic would mean how someone outside, if you're speaking anthropologically, how someone outside a group would define that group. Emic would be how the people define themselves. Does that make sense? So if you think about Indianness, the etic view of what Indianness is would be more the governmental view. It's more about colonial exploration, you know, surveying resources, where for the people, it's New World Contact. It's, you know, for the westward expansion and manifest destiny, the people are looking at their relationship to the land and a struggle to preserve their cultural ways and access to those resources. So the war over land became everything in terms of the development of the Americas. And it still goes on. We look at that with the fires going on in Brazil and intended sort of sleight of hand depopulation policies there to, after so much legislation to protect the indigenous populations as treasured aspects of their cultural heritage, eliminating those people still opens up the land for ranching and other mining and other exploitative measures. So I would say the etic view of this racialization is trifurcation. You know, trying to divide and separate into black, red, and white separate groups of people. When we look at their actual heritage and look at their actual makeup, many of us as Americans are part European, part American Indian, part African. In fact, this is what defines going into Latin America again. Let me remind you of the colonial policy of the Catholics. Where you have a Catholic colony, you're going to have the same miscegenation and the same story. So if you ask a Puerto Rican, what are you? They'll say, I'm Puerto Rican. So Boriqueño, Boriqueño, or Puerto Riqueño. So what does that mean? And there's this whole push now to call it by the Arawak and the Taino word, Borinquen, not Puerto Rico. And this identification as indigenous. And people will say, well, I'm part African, I'm part Spanish, and I'm part indigenous. And that's what it means to be Puerto Rican. You'll see the same thing in Brazil and so on. So opposite trifurcation, you have cross-cultural interaction, and then therefore this creolization, miscegenation, and the formation of new cultures, which is actually a beautiful thing. I think if we celebrated the actual history of America, we'd have a much more stable and less divided nation that could actually celebrate our true heritage as Americans. For example, here in New Orleans, the best French bread in New Orleans is made by German bakers. You know, the Italian seasoning is a part of the Creole cooking here. You know, it's all blended. But we wouldn't have gumbo. Gumbo is an African word. So these cultures sort of all come together. This is a quick example of my own family. Now, this is only from my mother's side. These are my great-great-great-grandparents. Now, I was brought up, they said that Classy Price was a full-blood Indian. Why did my great-grandmother insist that her grandmother was a full-blood Indian? I don't know. Because when I look at her, she looks to me like an African. Unless we begin to consider or open ourselves to the notion that possibly indigenous people had more of a black look than we imagined they did in earlier times. Bob Davis, they called him an Irishman. His mother was Irish, and he was a free person of color, FMC. In fact, he was a magistrate in Thibodaux, Louisiana. Now, Bob, he's got, different color eyes. His hair looks nappy. He's got this Asiatic eyes, but would still be considered black. Does that make sense? In other words, we're a lot more complicated in terms of who we are, and that should be celebrated and not hidden. We're taught to be ashamed, or you're trying to be something other than black if you claim to be American Indian, or if you acknowledge your European ancestors, you're shaming your African slave ancestors and so on. So the notion of black being synonymous with slave is something that really has to be checked, because the narrative of who and what black people are is a lot more complicated than that. In fact, the black Indian Paul Kufi was a wealthy merchant and slave owner in the East Coast. Crispus Attucks was a black Indian, the first man to fall in the American Revolution, shot that rang around the world. Frederick Douglass was a black Indian. You can look at it and see. So I think I'm being a little bit redundant. We get this idea of carnival expression, the notion of this, just this expression of Indianness is itself resistance, is my point. And, you know, we have to look at, are these people really, you know, what's the credibility to them claiming to be what they are? These are two of my buddies I grew up with, two of my best friends since third grade. You know, the guy up above here is a tailor. His mother's family are Tunicas, indigenous people. We used to tease him, say, oh man, you look Chinese, you know, and this, that, and the other. This guy is considered Creole, Randolph. Some German heritage there, but clearly have American Indian heritage and ancestry as well. But in today's racial categories, these guys would just be two more black guys. I'm going to skip over that. I want to expand this out of New Orleans and out of America and get to some more visuals. Here you have a photo from the Dominican Republic. You know, Morena, Zombos, in the caste system of the Spanish caste system, Zombo would be a black Indian. You wouldn't move up the caste if you were African and married an Indian, because you'd be moving laterally, not vertically in the caste system. But Zombo was that category. In Brazil, it gets even more complicated because you have different manifestations of that. People call themselves caboclos or pardo. They're part, or there's also criollo. There's Creoles in the northeast of Brazil as well, Maranhão. Now, I focus on Maranhão, Brazil, because their tradition, to me, even more than the caboclos of Pernambuco, looks like what we do here in New Orleans in terms of the beadwork and in terms of the manifestation and expression of Indianness and this African fusion with indigenous culture. And particularly in the Bumba Meu Boi tradition. Bumba Meu Boi in Maranhão, Brazil, is even bigger than Carnival in that particular part of Brazil. They celebrate it during the festival of São João or St. John and St. Peter or São Pedro, which is in the summer months, the end of June, beginning of July. And that time of year in Maranhão is bigger than Carnival. And they have Bumba Meu Boi celebrations and the Tambor de Criollo, which is straight up Congo drumming and dance from the Quilombo again being the runaway slave community or maroon community in Brazil known as Quilombos. And also focus on Maranhão because Maranhão has the largest number of these communities of all the states of Brazil. There's over 200 Quilombos in Maranhão alone in that state. And it also touches into the Amazon. So there's a whole Amazonian indigenous population there as well. This was part of the proposal I made to the Palmares Foundation to do this research and to look at, and I did get funding from the Brazilian government to help me with travel around Brazil and, you know, per diem and stuff to be able to get there and document some of this a cultural parallel, particularly Maranhão. And the Northeast culture, Nordeste, has its own manifestation in cities like Rio. It's very, very popular. And if you look at the archival images, there's some parallel energies there between, you know, the sort of image of the my mind blank for a second there. I'll come back to that. There's a name that they have for that particular character or type of person. Here you have a man playing a berimbau. This is an old image of the culture that is the essence of capoeira, which is another part of what I would like to share with you today. Capoeira itself was born out of resistance. And here I have my berimbau here. To give you an idea of what this man is holding. Am I okay to shift like this? Am I okay? I don't know how we're doing on time. But can you see it? It's this instrument is an African instrument that is theory to be about as old as a drum. In fact, you can find images of old rock art in Africa where it will say a hunter-gatherers hunting gazelles with the bow and arrow, and it's actually a guy herding cattle with the berimbau, over 100,000 years ago or something. So this instrument is very, very old, and it's used in capoeira for many different reasons. Hashishi. So the berimbau in capoeira, well, let me just define capoeira real quick. Capoeira is an African Brazilian martial art that was used, and it is a symbol today, much like the Mardi Gras Indian and this whole Indian image in and of itself is a symbol of resistance and cultural maintenance today. Because historically, capoeira was used by the Maroons, by Africans to escape slavery and to fight against the police, to fight against the army, and to establish free and independent communities in the forest. Much like the Maroon communities of Sao Malo, right here outside New Orleans, or Florida, the swamps of Florida. Fastnesses, very difficult to reach places. The largest quilombo was in Pernambuco, called the Quilombo Macaco, or Palmares. There's movies about Palmares. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Baganga Zumba and Zumbi. These were legendary folk heroes in Brazilian history, and they were the kings of Palmares. Capoeira then carries that energy into today, and it's practiced as a martial art, but it's played as a game. So the music is used to help govern and dictate sort of the style of the game, as well as the rhythm of the engagement. So it's a very, very lethal martial art that was used historically, again, to fight for freedom, but was later adopted and used by the police and even by elite guard and army in Brazil. So Queen Isabella, for example, had the Black Guard. We'll get to some capoeira images. I'm going to try to speed through images here. Checking time, let me see. Oh God, I'm out of time already. I haven't even shown a video. I knew that was going to happen.
Well, you take your time. You take as much time as you need. And if anyone has a 6 o'clock or has to be somewhere, feel free to, you're okay to leave if you'd like. But if you want to stick around and hear more, please feel free to do that as well. I know some of the students have 6 o'clock classes. So,
okay.
But keep going.
Okay. I'm glad to, and honored. Thank you. I had offered to do that. I'm glad to do that. I don't mind the time. I'm going to show you, because I promised to, a quick video of, can everyone see this video screen? Is anyone there?
No, can't see the video screen.
Okay, hang on a second. Visible now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, I apologize for the very crappy quality of the audio on this, as well as the imagery, but I want to share it anyway, just because it's Chief Warhorse talking about her ancestors. This was shot at Fontainebleau State Park on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, the other side of the lake from New Orleans. And she's explaining how her ancestors were the brick makers. So these people made bricks, and the Chata, not Choctaw, Chata, they actually built the Spanish forts, which were the oldest structures here. The Spanish were here in Louisiana before the French. We tend to think of it as a Francophone and French colony and French thing, French Creole, this thing. No, it was Spanish first, and then later French, and then became Spanish again. So let's see here, Chief Warhorse.
But our people speaks outdoors more. So they get up there.
The man that she's with
This is where my
is
people had to sit. Many of them died right here.
Dr. David M. Hotep. He has a book called Africans were the original Americans.
Something on, I see something going on.
I'm okay steaming because what's going up over here?
Because we're supposed to start building from this point back.
So she's pointing out
Now
that
over here where they pouring this concrete was a underground barbecue pit. And then this is another mound.
so she's explaining that we're actually standing on a mound. So the mound builders are these indigenous black
So
people,
the mounds go like
the antecedents of the Choctaw and Cherokee.
generations. So right now we still burying way out over toward the bushes of woods I showed you over there. But it starts from here going out. It starts from the water.
The marinas?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So these Choctaw brick makers
This mound.
exported their bricks and other goods
My people buried here.
across the waters.
Them old oak trees are headstones.
If you look up Chifuncta, you'll see that they were trading internationally 600 BC. We have, am I talking too loud? Is the audio conflicting? We have
So what's that doing?
pyramid mounds in Louisiana, all along the Mississippi River Valley, that are, in some cases, like in Poverty Point, larger than the Great Pyramids of Giza. There's ancient civilizations here.
And now they let them make a movie in there about 2 years ago.
Salmon Lodge.
So they calls it Salmon Lodge. They won't go back to the 1700s. There wasn't nobody around here named Salmon in the 1700s. This house was my grandfather, who was, at the time, he was what they would call the Alcalde of the Chifuncta.
Chifuncta.
Okay? So he was the leader over Lacombe. He was the leader, and this is even under the French and the Spain. He held court here even. You would have to bring all your cases to him here because he at the time was the chosen chief. So all business was taken care of by him, and that's recorded. And from these waters, they show boats and schooners that he took docks into New Orleans to sell or bring goods that he traded into New Orleans that they manufactured over here. So it's on their records, he was shipping stuff out from right here.
National trade.
So what she's, let me just jump in here for a second. What she's described or explaining is that the historic marker at this particular spot is wrong. And if she didn't press the state to correct or put and include the actual history that she knows, because she is Chata and is a descendant of the man who built this house, we wouldn't know the actual history.
Built this on a sound foundation. That's a breeder.
Oh, okay.
That kept the houses cool
And dry.
and dry at all times. Those are breeders. That was part of their structure of building.
Similar to Key House.
And then the white folks took this over. This had been a trading post. The army took it over at one time. And the army held our people off from here for a long time. Look at the rabbit. So go down and read the rest.
Okay. And the early settlers didn't build no bricks.
We, the Shapunka people, built the bricks that was here. So how do it become a French Creole when it was the Native American?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It's a good question. I'm going to skip around here, okay? Is that all right? Just for the sake of time. There's so many other things I want to share with you. Hang on. Now let's see. Oh, can you see my my Finder screen here? Now those bricks that she's describing were used to build the Spanish forts. Like I said, Fort Pike is one of them. I'm going to take you through some of the images of that. This is, can you see that clearly? Okay, this is Fort Pike. So this was built by the Chata, according to Chief Warhorse. And the only marker on site that mentions American Indians talks about Seminoles being held here as they were being removed from Florida to the Indian Territory. So there's no recognition of the Chata because they're not even charted, they're not even mapped on the, if you look at a map of indigenous nations, you might see Colapisa on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, but Colapisa in their language means the lookout. So when the guys came through and they said, "Who are you guys?" They said, "Colapisa." They're saying, "We're the lookout." But they wrote that down as the name of the tribe, and it's not. They're actually Chata or Chafunkta. And if you look up Chafunkta, it's very interesting. You see some, not a lot of information, but a validation of everything I'm saying to you about this pre-Columbian international cross-water trade. This is all images of Fort Pike. That's my daughter. This was years ago. She's 15 years old now. But if you can see, this is from the inside of the fort. And this was like the last holdout. Can you see my cursor moving over it? That was like the, if they got inside that wall, that was the inner retreat. Maybe you can see it better there. And this was, you know, I'm not sure the term, I'm not in so much into military history, but this would be where they would shoot from. And if you look at the bricks, you can see that they have this pock marks and hole. There's sun-baked bricks, they're not kiln bricks. Can you see that? So all of the early streets of New Orleans, the cobblestone streets and all those old Spanish buildings in the French quarters were made with these Chata bricks. More Fort Pike. A lot of people were enslaved and abused there. This is an image of actually my chief. I actually masked with the Indians with Carnival. And this is Big Chief Darrell Montana, the son of the man I said they have a bronze statue of him. This is his son, Darrell Montana, the son of Tootie Montana. If you look at this beadwork, it's just amazing. This is an archetype downtown style, which means that they're not showing these flat pictorial images and beadwork, but it's three-dimensional pagodas and designs that look Mayan and look Asiatic or Mesoamerican. And I asked Big Chief Tootie in person, I actually have it on camera. I asked him, what is the relationship between what you're doing as a Mardi Gras, quote unquote, Mardi Gras Indian and actual American Indian people? And he looked at me and laughed and said, we are the people. And he just kept repeating that. I didn't quite get it at the time. I'm going to breeze through some of these images here. These are all images of Daryl Montana's suits, details of his suits. This is an image of Sao Luis Maranhão as it's dressed up for the Festa de São João, São Pedro. They have banners everywhere, and it's almost like Moroccan-looking tiles covering the facades of all the buildings in that part. This was a Capoeira Angola roda from São Luís Maranhão, where they, interestingly enough, at the end of the Capoeira roda, brought in the bumba, the bull, as well as other elements. And one of the masters talked about the indigenous culture and its relationship to capoeira and capoeira's relationship to the Black Indian tradition of Maranhão, particularly the Bumba Meu Boi. This is all the masters. They invited me up because I was a guest visitor from the United States and a trained owl in Capoeira Angola. So they invited me up with the masters at the closing of it. This maestri has since passed. He died 2 years ago. And here you can see the frame drum that they use for the bumba. I'll show you a bumba video in a second. And these are the clackers that they use for Bumba Meu Boi. This is straight up Black Indian musical instrument from this particular state and part of Brazil. They don't use this hardly anywhere else. The cuica drum is also used for the bumba. And there's the bull, boy, Bumba Meu Boi. And if you can see, it's a lot of the same level beadwork that we use here in New Orleans. Bear with me, I'm going to keep flying through, okay? Now this is, I'm going to show you a quick video. Can you see this? The video? I'm not sure as I change screens if it's still sharing properly. Now that's shot in historic Tremé, which is one of the oldest neighborhoods in this country. And it was built as an integrated neighborhood to house the workers that would work in the French quarters and on the docks. And this neighborhood was integrated from its founding. You can't quite see it in this image, but right around the corner is St. Augustine Church. It's the oldest Catholic church in the country and was integrated from its founding, integrated pews from its founding. We could have fun with videos all day. I got more to show you though. This is an image of one of our Mardi Gras Indian chiefs, or Black Indian chiefs from New Orleans, David Montana, who's a nephew of Tootie, first cousin to my chief Daryl, marching with and supporting Chief Warhorse on the North Shore in Lacombe, Louisiana. So he's St. Tammany Parish of the old Florida Territory. And if you see here, it sees Chata Cherokee Creek. And her name, Chief Elwyn Warhorse Gillum. These are images. This is actually an image from the Quilombo in Maranhão. Quilombo, Maranhão. And you see the thatched roof and mud house motif the same as you saw in those archival or historic images. This was actually brought a Boomba group to New Orleans. And to our knowledge, it was the first time that Boomba Me Boy had been performed in North America or in the United States, to my knowledge. This was part of the exchange that I was working on with Brazil. This group is actually from Rio, but all of the people in the group are from Maranhão. They're all Maranhenses. And if you look at the people, you see the same triracial mixture. You know, some are more like African, part European, part indigenous. You know, that's who we are, right? And this is actually the back of the bronze sculpture of Chief Tutti Montana in Congo Square. I could talk about Congo Square forever itself. But Congo Square was where basically Africans held a marketplace during the colonial times and would perform drumming and various rituals. Prior to that, it was a stomp dance ground for the indigenous people. So this is sacred ground here in New Orleans, and it still is. The drummers are there every Sunday still, and people are drumming and dancing and making offerings at the oak trees and stuff to this day. This is Big Chief Yam. Now this is Uptown style Indians. He's from Uptown New Orleans. And you see his beadwork is flat and pictorial. I think some of the drawings are sometimes kind of crude, but it's still quite miraculous that they get all those beads in there to tell the story. Now, Yam to me is the archetype indigenous black person. I mean, this guy has the same frame, the same build that Chief Warhorse had. No behind, narrow waist, long legs, broad shoulders, short torso, big upper body, long legs. And there's wide cheekbones and certain look. That's an indigenous. This is Yancey, the spy bar for our tribe, Yellow Pocahontas, one of the oldest tribes. Now he's wearing a wig here, as was Yam. They wear the wig to look more quote unquote Indian, the archetype Indian. But Yancey's mother is a full-blood Chata. And this is his suit, downtown Indian style. This is Chief Darrell again. And you see that three-dimensional quality to the work. This was quite an amazing suit. The back of his crown were these two arches like this that he pulled strings and they opened up and then folded back behind him. It was very, very beautiful. I mean, what we're doing here is just, to me, it's mind-blowing. It's museum quality stuff. I mean, his suits are going for maybe 100,000 or more and are on display in museums internationally. So it's an artwork of the highest level. Here you can see the art actually pulled together. It's not a good shot. It's from the back, but you can see the crown where it makes the full crown. I'm going to show you a quick video of Darrell. Can everyone see the video screen? Yes? No? Yes or no? Chris is saying no.
I'm saying no because when you click the start, it just shows the picture. It won't show the actual screen. Like on the last video, we just saw the picture.
Okay, let me see. Do you see the text? No? Okay, 1 second. I'm learning Zoom. Hang on.
I saw a little arrow.
Wait, where am I? I'm gonna start over. Here we go. Bear with me 1 second. This video is about 5 minutes, so it's not long. It's a good, you get the rhythm and the energy. Okay, see it now? All right, I'll start it over. Is it full screen for you? Okay, good.
I can't wait to see it. You know, and when you hear people talking like that, that's the incentive to make you put in the 5,200 hours. It don't be about trying to outdo another guy from another people.
This was right after Katrina. This is
I feel like the suit that I'm working on now is the one.
and this suit was a tribute to his dad. If you look at it, you'll see a miniature of his dad as escaping. That's our hymn. You see, Tootie?
The people that come out there and look to see, oh, what he gonna have this time? And they hear the oohs and ahs and wow. You know, that's, and people say 15 minutes of fame.
This is Indian practice.
Involved in it now 40 years. I started when I was 10, and I made my first piece by 11, and I'm 51 now, so I got 40 years in this. I think of all the stuff I could have done if I, within those 40 years, a lot of stuff I didn't get a chance to do. But that's the reward, to know that, you was able to make that person have joy in what you do.
All right, let me pause and open up for questions. I have much more to share, but we're getting into an hour and a half here. I don't want to not give people a chance to ask.
Any questions from anyone? Any questions? Okay, well, I'm gonna ask one.
Please.
So I want to know about. I want to know a little bit more about some of the. I just lost the word.
It's okay. Take
After
your time.
5 o'clock, it'll come here in a second. But so we talked about like the brick making.
Yeah.
What were some of the other skills and things that were found in in the tribes that you mentioned that?
Well, I don't know anything more significant than the fact that the Chata were brick makers. I mean, that's a profound thing, that they were engaged in masonry, and that would have been prior to European contact. That is a profound thing in and of itself. It also lends itself back to this, sort of expanding out our view of what were the mound builders and who were they and what were they doing? Because again, we have pyramid mounds. We have serpent mounds, but pyramid mound cities where there clearly was a priest class. I mean, like I've taken my kids to Moundville in Alabama, where actually it's only 60 miles from my paternal, my dad's mother's family, the Rogers, and the land that was my great grandfather's there. It was only 60 miles away from Moundville. Moundville's right outside of Tuscaloosa. So I'm just trying to give you markers, okay? So Tuscaloosa, and you've heard of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Well, the word Tuscaloosa means black warrior in the Muskogee language. So there's something profound there. Tuscaloosa himself was described as a giant by DeSoto's men who massacred them, Tuscaloosa's people, lied to him and came in the guise of peace and attacked him. But they described him as a giant that wore the turban of a Moor. So there's something there. Now, you have some people claiming that there's this whole Moorish heritage, and that's what the whole being black Indian is. And there's a lot of confusion there. There were Moors here. Chief Warhorse's perspective on the Moors was that, no, we're not Moors. The Moors cut a deal with the Spanish to kill us. They were sent here to annihilate my people. We're not Moors. But there's something to that, because you have amongst the Seminoles, for example, the same tradition where they're wearing turbans and these plumes that later became ostrich plumes. Now, what feather was that? There's no ostriches in North America. So clearly there was something going on there, as well as the breastplates that they wore, more symbols. Again, hearkening to this notion that there was international trade and people sailing across the oceans back and forth. For example, Columbus's navigators, all of this information that opened up the new world came through those Moors that were already sailing back and forth, if that makes sense. So beyond them being city builders and, locally sort of creating, what is ultimately the infrastructure for old New Orleans, I don't have any other greater examples of that. But I can say that clearly the mound builders there's an intentional obfuscation of the reality of who was who. When I went to Moundville, you go to the archaeological park. I took my kids into the museum. When we went into the museum, the virtual video guide that greets you and explains who they are is the archetype Indian. The guy's almost butt naked with a breechcloth on and a wolf skin on his head. He's not wearing a turban of a Moor. He's not dressed in garb. You know, he looks like a Cheyenne or some Plains Indian guy. You understand? So that image, even there, is still being projected, I think, to sort of misinform and mislead people about who these people actually were and what they actually looked like.
Hey, Ivan,
Yeah.
can you hear me? I was listening to a lecture that Chief Warhorse did, and she was comparing the bricks that her people made to these bricks that are in Bolivia.
Okay. Yeah.
I've never seen that lecture. Hers.
Yeah. There's quite a few videos of her online, and she talks about some links between her people and the people in Bolivia. Clearly, there was trade and migrations and people moving throughout. So the culture that was here prior to the hunter-gatherer image and living in bark huts or teepees is much more like the Mesoamerican culture we get the same story in Mexico. You know, who were the Olmecs? Why did they look black? What about the Otomi? You know, I have a friend who's she's actually half Irish, half Otomi, and you know, her nose is like yours, Lori. Her lips are bigger than yours, you know, and she's got freckles, even though she's half Irish. She still has these kind of Negroid features because she's indigenous. So
Right.
people say, well, the Otomi and the Olmecs were clearly Africans. We don't know that for sure because the people were sailing back and forth. But what did those people look like that were indigenous here? You got Mexicans to this day that have pretty big lips and wide noses to this day. But if you look at where the black people in Mexico, they always talk about Yanga and Veracruz and the slaves that came in, because black, again, is synonymous with slave and coming from Africa.
You mentioned with the video where David Imhotep was in the video with Chief Warhorse.
Yeah.
In his book, The First Americans Were African.
Right.
When you came here before, you showed this BBC film
Yeah.
that I used in my capstone. But it talked about the bones of Louisa that were found in the Americas. Would you talk about that a little bit?
The bones of what?
Louisa, the woman's bones that they found in South America. So
Yeah, well, the thing that was interesting about that film was that it was the only thing that I've seen that clearly states without hesitation that it's a matter of fact that there were people here prior to the Bering Strait migration. They have clear archaeological evidence of it. And the people that were exhumed, they used basically the strata of rock to date the people. And they had to have been somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years ago. And when they did the forensics on 10 different bodies that were exhumed, all of them had Negroid features, not the quote unquote Mongoloid features they expected to see the archetype Indian look. They all looked African or like black people. And, you know, what's interesting there is that then it gives us sort of a different reference point. I mean, we're talking about people sailing across the Pacific, not the Atlantic. So a migration east from Africa across the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific, and the peopling of the Americas beginning at the southern tip of South America and migrating north into the Caribbean, which is a whole different ballgame. That's a whole different story. And that's the only film that I've seen that really summarize all of that and went as far as to validate it by looking at the DNA of those bodies exhumed and comparing it to contemporary people, and it being an exact match, those people that still live in Patagonia in the very southern tip of South America, and showing how their cosmology and their rituals are still to this day identical to those of the Australian Aborigines. So it's a very complex thing. Anecdotally, one of our friends you might know, Sonny Bilal, Bilal used to play with, he's a musician. He's played with a lot of famous people, Gil Scott-Heron. He's played with a lot of very famous artists, but part of our community here in New Orleans and Atlanta. But he's Garifuna from Belize. And when I asked Bilal, because the Garifuna are an example of Central American Black Indians. Garifuna speak Carib, the language of the Caribbean. Okay, you ask them what is their story, the narrative is, oh, well, these were people that were slaves on a ship that wrecked off the coast of St. Vincent, and they intermarried with the Indians there, and then they migrated to Belize and Honduras and Guatemala from St. Vincent. That's the story. And you ask any person, Garifuna, they'll say that is our story. When I asked Sonny Bilal, what is the story? He said, that's the story they tell, but no, we are the indigenous people. We were here. And he explained that their dances and rituals to this day are identical to the Mayans in Guatemala, in Honduras. So again, there's this weird thing where you have a Black indigenous and red indigenous population side by side that have parallel cultural practices, but don't necessarily become one people, which I find very unusual and cause for pause and examination from all sides all over again. Because it's the same reports I'm looking at from agents that documented the Seminoles in Florida, that you had these, the black people had the same structures and slept on the same types of beds, had the same diet, but they lived in separate communities from the quote unquote red Indians. Like, why is that? Who was who? So we assume these people were Africans that adapted to Indian ways rather than being still remnants of that indigenous Black population that still is autonomous and not necessarily absorbed into the red population that migrated across from Asia. Does that make sense? So my theory is that those people are still here, not just in Patagonia, but right here in New Orleans. But we're not looking for Indians, and what is considered Indian DNA is only going to point to that Bering Strait DNA. You understand? So I'm curious to know what is Chief Warhorse's DNA and to look at what is the story there and who she matches up with. I bet it's pretty unusual or unique. I know that I think it's O negative, O positive blood type is another common type amongst indigenous people. Doesn't necessarily mean you're Indian, but it's just one more way to begin to look at it. Did I answer?
We're at 6:39 here, so maybe if there's somebody else that has a question. Thaddeus, I see you on here. I know you have questions.
He was nodding and stuff. I was like, he's like, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You was speaking that game out there. If I could ask one question, what do you think was the critical shift in, the coalitions that we had together from, was it a mixture of the way slavery was treated in the Caribbean and American South? Was it the Indian treaties of the 1850s, the mid 1800s to late 1800s? Was it the Dawes Rolls? What was really the big element that really created this coloristic divide and this misinformation to not understand that we were one, or to break a lot of the coalitions that we had formed?
I kind of touched on it earlier. It began with Virginia policy. So when you hear people talk about, our history as African Americans began in Virginia in 1609 or whatever, what they're saying is that this was the beginning of Black people being defined as a group separate from white, separate from Indian. And the policies that I've seen, that's the earliest things I've seen, were the fallout or the result of the colonial power saying, look, you got to keep these people divided and the people being outnumbered. I'm looking at actual letters written to the King of England begging for support lest we lose the colony to runaway slaves and Indians. I mean, Georgia outlawed slavery for a period of at least 60 years. And you could not even bring a person of color into the state of Georgia unless they were accompanied by a white person or had some clear documentation that there were slaves or what the business was there, because uprisings and depredations were so prevalent. So the intention to kind of control and divide people was there all along, but you got to remember that it's not, you got to remember the Europeans were a part of that, because the early Europeans that came in weren't colonists. They were fur trappers. And they came trying to make a way and make a living, and most of them ended up living American Indian ways and intermarried into American Indian tribes and became American Indian chiefs. You understand? And so some of that European lineage stuff was actually through through the tribes, and people fought on both sides of that. Again, the Battle of Fort Mims is a good example. Here you have Red Sticks attacking a fort, but if you look at the actual record, you'll find part Creek, part white people fighting on the side of the Americans against the Red Sticks, as well as blacks, free or slave, fighting on the side of the Americans against the Red Sticks trying to free them. They were attacking plantations and freeing slaves until they attacked the fort. So, who's who and whose side was on whose side for why is pretty complex. They use different tactics, like getting American Indians to actually serve as trackers and hunters for runaway slaves, or trying to get people to agree to in their treaties, okay, you can keep your land and remain autonomous and have some sense of autonomy, agency, or whatever, but any other runaways that come to you, you got to turn them into us. Like even the Maroons of Jamaica cut a deal like that with the English crown. You understand? In fact, Battle of Orleans, you'll find Maroons from Jamaica, from the hills of Jamaica, who fought the Spanish and the British and whooped their behinds in British uniforms, fighting on the side of the British here in New Orleans. So it's really complex in terms of where people ended up landing. It was ultimately about survival, and the sort of collective thinking. Those that were pioneering enough to think in those terms usually couldn't get enough people with them. Like Tecumseh had that agenda, and he had quite a few people, followed him, but not enough to really turn things the other way. Antonio Gata in California stood up to the Americans and tried to unify tribes and factions that were normally divided. So divide and conquer is definitely, you're hitting the nail on the head. That's exactly how things work. But you got to also remember, it was a gradual process of westward expansion. All that was like gentrification. It was block by block. So, okay, we take this part and we'll sign a treaty. They go to sign a treaty with the Great Father in DC or whatever, and come back, and they've already crossed that creek and boundary that's agreed upon in the treaty, and they are encroaching on that land, and they start fighting again, and they sign another treaty. That treaty is violated, and so on and so on and so on. And so little by little, people move like that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that people traveled. We don't think of American Indian people traveling from the north to south and overseas and all that kind of stuff, but it was much more prevalent than we tend to imagine when we think about the past. People were just as sophisticated as we are, maybe around different things, but their mental acuity and even some of their old technologies, were more advanced than we can imagine.
Indeed, thank you.
Right on. Did I answer your question? I mean.
Oh, yes, you did. You did totally, because, a lot of it is just, they'll just stick it to, well, it's just a bunch of 5 Indians that signed on during the Dawes Roys. And it's like, it's got to be something more complex that goes to that. Right. And I've read, Dr. John Henry Clark, whenever he speaks about the Caribs and the Arawaks and how the South American slave trade was very different than the North American slave trade, because they learned from things like the Haitian Revolution that right. They would revolt if you let them even keep the language, drum beats and things like that. So they had to disenfranchise the entire culture and break them up. Kind of a follow-up. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but a follow-up question.
Let me correct you real quick. One of the things that I noticed when I talk about the Catholic colony is that the Catholics realize you got to let them have some semblance of their culture so they remain more peace. And that's why here in New Orleans, the drum was legal until they created a new code. So in early colonial times, the drum wasn't illegal in New Orleans, where it was illegal everywhere else in the continental United States. If that makes sense. That's why we have jazz and blues and all those things in the Mardi Gras tradition, all these drumming traditions on the street that's survived here. The voodoo and other things that survived here. I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, yeah, you're great. Thank you. So with how you were talking about that we had more explorers around that time, and you talked about Chicago, what were some of the explorers and the relations to the Aboriginal descent in, more Western states like California and Sacramento and, the Sacrament and kind of their practices that they had there, if you can speak on that?
Really not versed on that. I'm not going to present I'm not going to, try to act like I know something I don't. I honestly have not really looked at that. One of the things that I do find urgent to share, though, about Mesoamerica and the West is this whole Spanish thing is a lot more complicated than we tend to think. Okay, I'll give you an anecdote. I'm in Sedona, Arizona, and, looking at these rock formations that look clearly like carved faces or something. There's some spiritual thing going on there. And what the hell is this? I'm seeing faces in the rocks, man, And so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take me a rock, just as a token, right? Just a small one, right? And when I went to go reach for it, I heard a voice say, he's gonna take a rock. Like that, almost like these rock faces were talking about me. I turned and looked behind me, and down the hill of the driveway were the guardians of that place. Well, I was actually at the Frank Lloyd Wright Church of the Holy Cross. It's like a cross built in the mountain. And the guys had the big cholo mustaches, You know what I mean? And the big hats look like Mexicans. They're not Mexicans. They were indigenous people, Anasazi people. They were native to, you understand? So we tend to think about Mexicans as some people go to the border, but all of that was Mexico. So they speak Spanish or have Spanish names, not because they came from Mexico, but because they were colonized by the Spanish. So it's important to remember that kind of stuff when you start to look west, and you'll see a lot of the same things, that these archetypes shift. The Chicano thing, the Cholo, all that's Indian. That's all expressions of Indian identity. Same thing with the lowriders and the graffiti. It's all Indianness. It's the same thing.
Well, thank you so much for your time and being so gracious with it. Really appreciate all that you shared with us. And for those who are still on, thank you for taking advantage of this celebration of November, which is Indigenous People Month. We can choose to learn and know more and understand our history, or we can choose to accept what we're told. So hopefully this has been a start for everyone that's still on to do some more research, learn some more, and continue to expand. Ivan, thank you so much for.
Thank you. I'm truly honored.
The information was phenomenal.
Wow, thank you. I'm honored. I have so much more to share. I didn't get to the capoeira video.
Well, it seems like we're gonna have to bring you back. So we'll work something out and make sure everybody knows when you're coming back and can hear the second half.
Yeah, we could go further to Brazil. Yeah.
You lucky President Wood ain't on. I was gonna make him hire you.
Okay. Our president was on there for a little bit, and I don't think he lasted. So I'm sure he probably had to teach him something.
I want to make an apology to Angel. Angel had prepared a nice introduction for you, and so maybe Angel, do you have anything you want to say to close us out? A question or anything?
No, I don't have any questions. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and for educating us about the Black Indians.
Oh, thank you, Angel. And thanks for calling to get more info. I'm sorry we didn't even get to the. I was so nervous about the technology and getting started and stuff.
Yeah, no worries.
Well, maybe Ivan, you can close us out with a 1 minute of capoeira video, since some people may have seen what it is.
Okay, let me see what I can pull up here in a second. I apologize. The audio on this is really crappy. There's a feedback on there. Yeah. I'm gonna skip forward here.
Would flee from their owners. And this kind of fight, if you realize, you pay attention to the movements, they almost in majority happen at the level of the ground, you know. But that's what the name capoeira comes from, because it's going to stay hidden in the capoeira, which is a small place. So the grass or strong. Yes. And you know, jump over anybody who was, running, hit them with the feet, because they were guns in their hands. So they would have to use.
So this is Capoeira Angola, which is more traditional, more African, more ritualized. Tends to be done slower, more drunken, more low on the ground, more like Tai Chi, as opposed to Capoeira Regional, which is more like Taekwondo. Here you see women, children all play Capoeira. You see the game, it's an interlocking game of movements and escapes. It's not rehearsed, it's all improvised. Conversation. There's 2 more seconds there. You guys can action for that. So we're sitting in a roda, a circle. You see the beating bowls, the pandeiro, the tambourine, just like the Mardi Gras uses. The scraper, the cowbell, and then the drum off the bottom. So again, this is Capoeira Angola. This is Capoeira Regional, contemporâneo. More acrobatic, much more dangerous. Tends to be faster. Maybe one beating bow. Emphasizes more the fight. More combative.
My name is Fernando,
Right?
and I work here.
That's good.
Thank you, Ivan.
All right, thank you. It was an honor. Went 2 hours instead of 1. But that's good. Thank
All
you.
right. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining
All right.
us.
Thank you all. Thank you, Laura. Feel free to hit me up. Y'all can find me on Facebook and share more.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
All right. Good night.